There we go. Last week we closed by discussing Goliath's height there. And one of the main things that I just totally forgot about, I don't know why I sometimes blank on these things, but I talked about the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text. And the Hebrew text says that Goliath was close to 9 feet tall, 6 cubits and a span in verse 4 of chapter 17. But you might find a little note somewhere. I have one in my Bible that points out that the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll and Josephus say 4 cubits and a span, which is only like 6'8" or 6'9". So it's still tall. It's remarkably tall, especially in the ancient world where people didn't get that tall usually. But it's one of those disagreements between the two texts. And there's multiple people who've written doctoral dissertations on which groupings of texts is more accurate than the other. I don't typically get too caught up in these things because, I believe our Lord turned water into wine and created the world with his almighty word. So whether Goliath was 6 feet or 9 feet, I don't know. But he was certainly a lot taller than anyone else. And there was something kind of diabolical about him that we find as we read the text. So just wanted to make that clarification, that note of difference between those two sources. So we'll begin there in verse 5, describing Goliath. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me." All right, so Goliath is arrayed in incredibly advanced technology for those days, right? He has bronze, he has these alloys of steel, he has iron, he has a shield bearer, and he has armor, not just a breastplate or a shield, but even has armor on his legs. The image we should be getting of Goliath is this is someone who is, essentially a giant. This is someone who is huge. He is more strong and experienced than any of the soldiers of Israel. Israel, kind of when you scrape together everything they had like 2 swords, right? Jonathan and David had swords, and that was about it. They didn't have a lot of technology. We remember from the book of Judges that when they were fighting, sometimes they would fight with farm tools because they had so little. They really didn't have a lot. And these men were, these seafaring soldiers. There's a lot of connections that were drawn in the ancient world and commentaries between the kingdom of Sparta and the Philistines, that there might be some kind of trade or dealings between the two of them. And Sparta is this great military nation, right? The one that basically outfights any of the other nations. So Goliath, by all human standards, is a towering and terrifying opponent. And you can see why no one else wants to challenge him, right? Goliath is basically saying, we can put this whole thing just on single combat between the two of us, and that will decide the battle, which we'll find out isn't really meant, but it's just kind of a boast, right? And there's an interesting thing that he points out, and you kind of see his worldview a little bit. He stands and he shouts at them, "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants?" And again, that word can mean slaves of Saul. So again, there's that notion of we're free. We're these strong soldiers. And you are just slaves of Saul. You just belong to Saul. You're servants of Saul. And he's really pointing out the weakness of Saul, right? Because the idea is if Saul is supposed to be king, then as king, he's supposed to be the one who's fighting on behalf of the nation, right? There shouldn't be any delay. The way things should be going is that Saul should be the one who goes straight up and fights Goliath first and foremost. That's why he gets to be king, because the king, again, in those days and in the classical sense, a king was a king because he fought for you, because he was there on the front lines, because he was the strongest military man. That's why you would pick a king in the ancient world. It wasn't just, it was someone's son or whatever. No. He was chosen to be a warrior. And so Goliath is pointing out that in his estimation, Saul not only is an unworthy man, but he's not really even a man, because he's saying, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. So this is in essence not just like a military challenge, but almost a political challenge of like, you guys serve Saul and he isn't even man enough to come down and fight me. So maybe you need to pick another king. Maybe you need to pick someone else who's man enough. And it's really interesting how these words, coupled with David coming forth, are almost in a weird way prophetic. There are a few moments in Scripture where God actually has the bad guy say something that actually is sort of dripping with irony and poetic justice, right? It reminds us of when the high priest says in the times of Jesus, man, it'd be better if one man would die for the sake of the whole nation than that there'd be, all of this upheaval. And he didn't really know what he was saying, but he was pointing to Christ who would die for the whole nation. So that's kind of what Goliath is doing here. He's sort of saying, pick a man that you want to be king and make him fight me. Choose a man for yourselves. Verse 9, if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants, again, slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. So again, he's being very brazen. He doesn't have any fear at all from what we see here. He is totally and supremely confident in himself. Verse 11, let's see how Saul responds. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. All right, so you remember last time we had mentioned, where is this battle taking place? Well, it's taking place in the Valley of Elah. It's in the territory of Judah. So it's sort of like, I don't know, if Jarvis was the battlefield and Fisherville was where David was from, it's not a far commute. Like, it's an easy traveling between the two of them. So what happens, the battle lines are drawn. Jesse's oldest sons go into battle. We remember these sons. These were the ones that God said he didn't choose. Remember, Samuel went to Jesse and said, which of your sons should be, show me your sons, because one of them is going to be king. And Jesse lines up, his sort of 3 oldest boys and says, these are the ones. And Samuel is told by God, no, not any of these. And so they go off to battle. And then we read that, David was already anointed king. He was supposed to be king. And then we read that he was entering into Saul's service. But now it seems like we've jumped in time a little bit, because he's just back at the farm. He's still tending to the sheep. So there's this understanding that even though David is, even though he's supposed to be the next king, and Jesse probably knows this, in the household, he's still not the king, right? He's still the little shepherd boy. He still has to do his chores. And so he's basically doing these chores. He has to still go and tend to the sheep, so he can't go off to battle and glory and all of these things. And so you get this sense that he's like the kid brother who comes along and he wants to see what his older brothers are doing in this war that's happening so near to them. So David is going back and forth. He's tending to the flock when all of this happens. Now, the thing that always amazes me when I read this is how long this goes on for. Verse 16 tells us, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening." Now, this tells us something about both the timidity of Saul, if I'm being kind, but it also tells us about the way that battles were fought back then. Back then, they would have sieges. A lot of the times, winning a battle was simply outlasting in terms of stamina your opponent. So they weren't typically quick battles that just happened right away. These could be long, drawn-out campaigns. And kind of the idea, too, is, if you're taking all of these men away from their families and from their fields and stuff like that, there's going to be a huge economic toll on the country, right? To just have all of these people stop farming, stop working in all of their professions and being there ready for battle, it's going to cost the country this huge thing. Whereas the Philistines, you get the sense they are these locusts, they are these marauders. They don't have fields to tend to. And so it doesn't bother them to sit out there for 40 days taunting and posturing for their battles, because they know someone else is going to be doing their kind of farm work for them. They're just going to be there to collect the spoil at the end of the day. And that's sort of how they organize themselves. So this goes on for 40 days. This is an agonizing, ongoing thing where every day it's this ongoing insult to both Israel and to the God of Israel. And it kind of shows us as well how sometimes when a bad situation goes on for a long time, sometimes you can almost become callous to it. You can almost forget that there's something wrong with it in the first place. And it kind of makes your conscience dull. And I think that's sort of what happens when David shows up here. Verse 17, "And Jesse said to David his son, 'Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers, and take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them.'" So this is interesting. Jesse is a very calculating man. We remember when Samuel first showed up, he said, are you here for trouble, or are you, why are you in my town? He's very concerned about politics and appearances. Jesse is someone who has a very close understanding of how this society works. And I say that because he sends off the bread to his sons so that they'll have their lunches, basically. But the best food, the rarest food, the most expensive food that they could come up with kind of in that day was cheese. And who is the cheese going to? Yeah, the commanding officers of his sons, right? So he has that sense of, I'm not going to give the cheese to my sons, right? I'm going to give them to the commanding officers. And it's probably a dual purpose, right? That sense of, on the one hand, it's probably like getting his sons in a closer relationship or in a better position. But there might also be that practicality of, sometimes when you send things off to war, it's the commanding officers who get to go through the mail first anyway. So there might be that sense of, they're going to take it either way. So you might as well wrap a bow on it and put their name on it so that they know who it's coming from, in that sense that, it just shows that Jesse's shrewd, basically, and that Jesse uses what he can to... I mean, maybe to spare his sons, right? There is that understanding that, when people are in a special position, they get kind of exempt. There's this play, but it's based on history of, I think it's called My Boy Jack, about Rudyard Kipling's son in the First World War, and how Rudyard Kipling was this famous author. He wrote The Jungle Book and all of these famous novels, and everyone kind of worshipped him as this hero. But he wanted his son to go to war because he so idolized soldiers. But the idea was his son kept getting deferments because the doctors were trying to be nice to him, right? And there was this sense that it was like, well, we don't want him to go to the front lines. And he basically does everything. Well, I won't spoil the play, but this is the idea that basically Jesse is kind of bribing or kind of sending along gifts, let's say, careful gifts to the commander for his sons. All right, and so he's to take them to the commanders and see if his brothers are well. Verse 19, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard them. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So we get this sense that these people are still pretty skittish, right? So the battle line's drawn up. They're ready for their conventional warfare that they kind of signed up for, soldier against soldier. But then all of a sudden up comes Goliath, this champion, and they are terrified and they're fleeing. And then the kind of talk amongst the troops, the talk on the front lines there is, oh man, if anyone took on Goliath, man, the king would make him rich. And, we don't hear whether Saul had offered that or held that out as some kind of bribe, or if that's just a guess from the soldiers of like, man, every day he's insulting Saul, and, whoever gets rid of him, Saul's probably going to really like. But we get this sense that, it's this big gamble, and yet no one's going to make it because Goliath is that terrifying. And again, we get this sense of how the people were really in bondage to their king, because we get that line that's kind of curious, make his father's house free in Israel. So there's that sense that they won't have to pay taxes, they won't be obligated to do all these things and serve the king in the way that everyone else has to serve them. So it's really going to be this gift for their whole family if they're going to be the ones. And so David's there. He's, the little kid brother. And we read on, verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. So we get David coming in, and David, I think it's fair to say, David is a little bit naive, right? He's not a soldier who's been enlisted. He's not there having to fight the battle. And so he shows up, and all he's saying is, wow, you have this guy who is insulting Israel. He's really concerned for his country, right? He says, who will take away the reproach from Israel. Reproach is, again, this $5 word for like the embarrassment, the national scandal that we are being opposed by these Philistines. So you get that. Then, of course, you get that sense of, man, what's going to be done for the soldier who takes out Goliath? So there is some sense of the benefits that this will have for him and for his family. But the interesting thing here we get again in verse 26 is the same thing that Jonathan said when he took on the Philistines. He points to the notion of circumcision. And this isn't like crass locker room talk. This, remember, circumcision is a placeholder for baptism. So essentially what David is saying is like, who's going to take out this pain? Like, he doesn't even believe in God. He doesn't even have baptism. He's not even a part of God's promises. He has no covenant, no blessing from God, and yet he's challenging God's armies. And it's interesting the way that David characterizes things versus Goliath. Goliath says, well, you're the army of Saul. But according to David, who is this the army of? The armies of the living God, right? So David has a very different political philosophy. In a sense, he's not a monarchist. He's a theocrat, right? David still knows that God is in control of the country, right? And so David is saying, they're not just insulting Saul, they're insulting the Lord. And that's a big deal. And he doesn't have the promises. We do have the promises. And that's the big thing that matters to David. And that's what mattered to Jonathan, too. There was that sense with Jonathan where when he challenged them, he said, these guys, they don't even have the promises. They don't have the covenant that we have. It's a remarkable faith that David has in the means of grace, you might say. This is the way that when you read Luther, he talks about baptism. Where he says, we're baptized, we're Christians, we have the word of God. God has given us all of these things. And the things that we tend to gloss over or forget or just view as accidents of birth, men of faith always look to, and women of faith look to and confess these as important, as defining, as game-changing. And so that's what's so important to David, is that God is there. All right, now let's see how all the other soldiers are going to take David's talk. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. All right, big brother's gonna push down little David. What does he say David's just there for? He just wants to see the blood and guts, right? He's just a teenage boy. He just wants to see the action, right? This is the stress of a real soldier, right? Eliab is there on the front lines. He's saying, get lost, little brother. Who'd you even leave the sheep with? Are you even supposed to be here? I know how evil you are. You're not a real soldier. We're the ones who are here, risking our lives. And you're just wanting to watch it like a sport. So you get that anger from his brother. And David, like me and many other little brothers, doesn't listen to his older brother. Verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. All right, so David is there, you can sort of almost see him saying, oh, pick me, I'll fight him, right? And the older soldiers are kind of shouting at him and talking down to him. And word gets to Saul in his tent that basically, there's this little kid out there who's stirring up trouble. And Saul brings him in and tries to impress upon him the weight and the seriousness of, what he's going to do. And there's this sort of paternal moment where Saul is looking at him and saying, son, you're just a kid. This guy has been killing men since he was a kid. This guy is a real trained soldier. And it's interesting, we get this background about David at this point. What's David's argument? What is he saying that equips him for this moment? He's killed lions and bears, right? I mean, in his defense, that's pretty impressive. And you get that phrase, I grab him by the beard, which I thought was hilarious. That notion that, he grabs the lion's mane and he beats it and kills it. And that's what he does, which is wild. I mean, to this day in Africa, there are still tribes that will hunt lions, with basically spears and stuff like that. But it's beyond me to imagine that type of battle. But David says that he's been equipped for all of this. And it's interesting how God has taken his role as a shepherd, basically someone who just watches sheep. That's all his job is, to lead these dumb animals to grass so that they can eat and then lead them back in the pen. That's it. And yet God has equipped David in all of these ways, right? David is fit. He is there doing his chores. He's faithfully serving as a son. He's following the table of duties in the catechism. And he's out there and he's saying, I've already been equipped. I've already been trained in this way. He's not a soldier, but what he's arguing is basically, I have that fight in me where I can take him on. And it's really interesting because, again, what was Goliath's boast? If Israel sends out a man and they lose, what does Goliath say? The deal is Israel becomes, they become basically a vassal state of Philistia, right? Of the Philistines. So it's a pretty big deal who you send out to battle, right? You want to send someone out who's willing to do it. But it's interesting that David is the only one. There's no one else who's even willing to fight. That's how desperate Saul is. He's at this point where it's been 40 days and no one has stood up to battle Goliath. David is the first one. But again, David says, I'm equipped. I've killed bears and lions before. And the main thing David's pointing out that no one else seems to care about is David saying, he's uncircumcised. He doesn't have the God of Israel on his side, and we are the armies of the living God. He's defied the armies of the living God. So David is looking at this from the perspective of God is real and will intervene and will help, and everyone else is looking at it quite rationalistically, you might say. They're all very enlightened people who don't view God as intervening, right? They're doing what the Enlightenment did, nisi deus non deritur, right? As if God were not a given. That's how they're planning ahead. And David just says, I'll do it. Verse 37, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Now, at this point, I'm thinking, how is Saul, at this point, why is Saul saying that, right? He is putting all of his bets on this child. This is the moment, again, where Saul should be saying to himself, this teenage boy is going to fight. And this should be a huge embarrassment to Saul. Saul is the one who's supposed to go and fight, right? There's been moments of, how would I put it what do I have to lose? There's been moments of great embarrassment in my life where there's things like, I remember once, I think Audrey, my daughter, had said something like, well, Dad, can we get, a pizza or something for dinner tonight? And I said something like, well, Daddy doesn't have enough money to get a pizza for tonight. And then she'd go to her piggy bank and pull out, the money from Christmas and said, I have enough for us to get pizza tonight. And, that kind of smacks you upside the head as a provider. And you say, you know what? No, keep your money. I'll do it. I'll make it work. I'll figure out a way. And so you just go and you do it, right? And that's what Saul should do at this point. This is the wake-up call. This is the moment we're supposed to read in the next verse. And Saul smacked himself in the face and said, sorry, I now realize I'm the king of Israel. I should go out. But what Saul says is, good luck, buddy. Go on out. Best of luck. And he says, go and the Lord be with you. And we don't know how Saul says this, but we know that Saul is getting pretty cynical at this point. So maybe there's just this sense of, He's the young kid who's saying, well, I can go and do it with God's help. And Saul is just saying, good luck with God there, buddy. He's not really that confident, I think. And another thing to point out, though, as well is God uses David, even though he's a youth. And there's something about young men and their courage. And I know I've told this story before, but it's a good story, so I'm going to tell it again. When I lived in England, we were sort of near a military base. And one of the things that the Royal Marines would have to do before they could be sort of licensed or made official soldiers was there's this big hill, and there was a zip line that went down, and it went down over this huge gap where if you let go, you would definitely fall and die, right? And so they had this zip line up, and it was the last thing that they had to do to sort of simulate what it would be like going down in a parachute or something like that. I don't really know what the exact tactical purpose was, but they would have to go down the zip line. And the story was in the area that some soldiers would get through all their basic training and they do everything, and they get to that moment where the only thing keeping them alive was their grip on those handlebars, and it's like, you better hope that you can do a pull-up, because otherwise you're careening down, right? And so apparently a lot of men at that point just said, forget it, and they couldn't do it. Now, the interesting news story was that teenage boys were going up there in the middle of the night and going down the zip line for fun. And so they had to take it down at night in between the training of the soldiers because they didn't want teenage boys to hurt themselves. And so it was kind of an interesting lesson of the difference. You can almost have that foolhardy courage of a young man versus, a little bit of wisdom that an older soldier would have, right? And so I think there's a little bit of that at work, we might say, with yeah. So teenagers don't have that level of fear, right? And so David doesn't, and Saul sends him off.
Pastor?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to me like Saul is ready to accept the deal if he's going to send little David out.
Yeah. Well,
that if David loses, we're still going to have the battle anyway.
Exactly. And I think that's a wise insight. And I think what we're going to find is that the Philistines aren't going to accept the deal either, right? Like it's one of those things where you put out the deal and it sounds like a nice sort of thing, but at the end of the day, people are people and they're just going to fight down to, the end for what they have. So from Saul's perspective, I mean, he's kind of a sneaky, slippery, conniving guy, right? He can maybe say, this is a shepherd boy who just came up. He's not even enlisted. He's not on the rolls as a soldier. So sort of like, what does he have to lose, right? He could maybe send David. And if David dies, he can say, oh, no, that was just a kid. I mean, I don't know exactly. I think there's some officiality to what Saul is doing. But I think you're right. Yeah, Saul is not someone who really cares a whole lot about the letter of the law. He just does what's pragmatically best for him at any given moment. So, yeah. Any other comments? I know I'm kind of talking this whole time. Any other questions, comments? We're going through a lot, but it's a dramatic story. All right, so verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. All right, so it's kind of a comedic moment right here, right? Because God has told Saul through the mouth of Samuel, I've chosen a man who's better than you, who's going to replace you. And Saul's angry about this, but then Saul won't go to battle. And so he sends David in. And then he takes the king's uniform, right? He takes his armor, he takes his sword, and he's the one himself who dresses David as king. I mean, this is high comedy for us. This is pointing out to us, this is in a sense, hold my crown for a minute, David. This is basically what Saul is doing. And then the Hebrew here is kind of funny. It says, he tried in vain to go or to walk. And you can have two different readings of this. The one sympathetic reading says, well, David just said, I don't feel comfortable in your armor, and I've not tested your weapon in battle, so I don't want to use it. That's the sympathetic reading. The other reading you can have of it is David has all this armor put on him, and he's too weak to even walk in all of it. Like it's like you put this huge suit on him.
Like when your kid goes in your shoes, or like
yeah. Or like if you ever remember, I don't know if they did this when you were a kid. When we were kids, they had the firefighters come into school, and they would put on all of the firefighting equipment onto, one of the boys, and he would be covered with this heavy, fire-resistant jacket and this big helmet, and he would barely be able to walk at all. And I think that's kind of what's happening with David here. But the idea is that David is going to have nothing. He's not just a weaker youth, but he doesn't even have the weaponry that Goliath is going to have. He doesn't even have the equipment. Yeah, ask a question.
So I noticed in the wording in mine, it says, because I'm not used to them.
Yes.
I wonder, getting used to something, I'm not used to something that implies you're going to get used to it eventually. Is that a...
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know for sure if I could grammatically make that argument, but it certainly seems to be an interesting point that David will get used to them. He will become a soldier. He will be the king of Israel. So.
And was that sort of his way of sort of hinting?
Maybe. I think whether or not that is the case, I think it's interesting that David has been anointed king by Samuel. So in David's mind, who is the one who should actually go against Goliath? David. So Saul already has the job, right? He already has sort of the paperwork and the crown and everything like that. He's the one on the coins. Everyone knows that he's king, but he won't do the job of being king, right? He won't go out and actually fight for his people. Now, David doesn't have any of the benefits. He's still doing chores at home, but he sees these enemies and he thinks, oh man, I'm the king of Israel. I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to fight for my people and my nation, right?
Did they have a rule, well, Saul being the first, who knows, but did they have a rule that Saul had to die before David could act?
They didn't have anything. Yeah, it was just the way that God had ordained it. He had said he chose a king, and then it was supposed to theoretically be like David had been. The closest analogy we could come to in history is in Europe. The popes would sometimes depose kings, where they basically could say, so-and-so is no longer the king, this person is the king. And then all of the people would go with them and say, thanks anyway, we'll be needing that crown and all of that stuff, and basically take all of it and make the next person king. So that's the closest thing I could think of. But we see in the nation of Israel, there isn't that devout faith that I think those people had in Europe, or at least that fear they had of the papacy in Europe. That doesn't really exist with Samuel, and Samuel consecrates David as king, but he doesn't do it in this public way where he's gathered everyone else around him. So it's almost an interesting kind of trial for David, whether he's going to stand up and be the king, whether he's going to stand up and do the job first. And it kind of reminds me a little bit, this is definitely self-glorifying, but it reminds me a little bit of vicarage. Where on vicarage in our church body, we send a man to go and be a pastor. And he doesn't get any of the rights of being a pastor, right? He can't, every word that he preaches from the pulpit has to be read and approved of by someone else. Every duty that he carries out has to be gone over and scrutinized by another person. But often he has to do all of the work of a pastor. And that's what David is doing here. He's sort of on his vicarage for kingship, right? He has to go and do all the hard part of being a king without any of the glory of being a king. And that proves his place. That kind of cements that he's the one who should be there. Any other questions, comments, concerns on the text? I think that's also the last thing, and again, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I wanted to mention it. I'd heard a good sermon once on the armor of Saul on David. I think it's a good example for us as well, that there isn't always necessarily one way to lead. Saul is a certain type of king, and David's going to be a different type of king. And so it's okay that David doesn't necessarily use, the sword and wear the armor and all of that. And I think it's the same in life as well. Not every father and mother, not every ruler or politician, not every pastor is going to be exactly the same. You can carry that office and carry out those duties that God gives to leaders in a different way, and that's all right. It doesn't mean that you can't do the job. There can be differences while the same task is being accomplished, right? I'm confident that David could have gone out with a slingshot or a sword or a spear or anything, and God would have been able to give him the victory over Goliath. All right, moving on here. Verse 40, Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. So again, we sometimes talk about David and Goliath as, well, Goliath had all these weapons and David just had a sling and, a staff. Well, what does David actually say that he has?
He has God on his side.
Yeah, he says that he comes in the name of the Lord of hosts. So he has the name of God. Dearly beloved, everywhere you go as a baptized Christian, you go with the name of God. You have that going over you, protecting you, marking you as one of the royal priesthood and the holy nation in the line of Christ and David and all of these heroes of the faith. So David says, all I need is God's name and I can beat you. And God's name, the other thing, I can hear my Hebrew professor whacking me on the back of the head with these words. When it says the name of God, it means the description of God's acts, of what God does, right? So Jesus' name means Yahweh saves. God's name throughout the Old Testament is often, there's all these titles that are used for God in worship, right? So we remember when Abraham is making the sacrifice of Isaac on the mountain, and then God spares Isaac and he sends the ram. He calls on God, Jehovah Jireh is the King James version. But the idea is the Lord, the provider, the one who provides, right? And so what is the name of God? The name of God is I am that I am. I always will be. I was there in the beginning. I'll be there at the end. I am the Alpha, the Omega. So what is the name of God? Well, it tells us that he is the deliverer, that he survives, that he doesn't lose. And so when David says he comes forward with God's name, he comes forward basically with God's resume of knowing who God is and what he does. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Now, just a little detail. They're not really concerned with the wildlife getting to eat. The reason they keep mentioning that the birds and the beasts are going to eat the bodies, what are they getting at? Why do they keep saying that? Is that just kind of like trash talk in a sports game? No. It was a big deal in the ancient world that you were buried. It doesn't matter what your religion was, whether you were a pagan or a Jew. Burial was very important. And for a lot of pagans, there's that play Antigone where the girl risks her life to bury her brother after a battle because it's so important that burial is kept in a certain way. And so it's a huge disgrace to have your body just left out and to not be properly buried. So it's not just the threat of death that they have, it's also the threat of, your body's going to be desecrated. You're not going to even get a burial. And that probably doesn't strike us as that big of a deal nowadays, but it was a really big deal back then, and that's why it's a part of their taunts. And it's a reminder of why it's important for us to manage a cemetery and to have an orderly way of laying people's remains to rest, because it is a universal human tradition to show dignity to the dead. All right, let's get to the action. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout, and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. All right, so a couple practical details here. So David is able to kill him with a sling with a stone. Pretty incredible, but I don't want to get into all the mechanics, but slingshots are dangerous. People can still do all sorts of danger with them to this day. And there's this remarkable tradition in the Middle East of people with slings. You can see them hit, these tiny targets and stuff like that. So David is equipped, and he manages to find the weak spot and kills Goliath, beheads him, and then they pursue the Philistines. And this is interesting. It tells us about the Philistines that the Philistines aren't going to keep their promise either, right? They're not going to sit there and serve Israel, and that they basically are a strongman country. They follow whoever's the strongest and the toughest. They have that pentarchy, right? They have the 5 cities where there's a big, strong king in each of the cities, and they just go out of their cities and plunder. And now they're getting plundered, right? It says David goes and he gets all the spoil from their camp, and he chases them all the way back to their locked city. So basically they're hiding with their doors shut. And it's a hilarious reversal of what has normally happened, right? And there's this sense among the Philistines, perhaps, this is speculative, but I would speculate that there is this sense among the Philistines. The Philistines have seen Yahweh at work. They have seen the Lord destroy, Dagon's idol in the temple. We remember that with Samson and with the Ark of the Covenant. They have seen that at times God gives great victory to this people of Israel. And it's almost like one of these fluke things of there's certain days where when Israel's winning, that's time to go home. And otherwise, we can trample all over them and we can beat them. But this is one of those times that they just run. And so they turn and they flee. And Israel pursues, the armies pursue. David's leading, funnily enough, he's leading his older brothers who were there, criticizing him at the very beginning. They have to follow their little brother in the battle, and they pursue the Philistines and get all the way to Gath and Ekron, which was some distance. And then they came back and just plundered the camp. And David takes the head of Goliath and he brings it to Jerusalem. And he puts Goliath's armor in his tent. Now, this is not something that's talked about a whole lot, but it's kind of weird. Even in the ancient world standards, it's one thing to beat an enemy, but we're going to find out that David keeps Goliath's head for like a really long time, like a very eerie amount of time. You almost kind of picture David in his old age with Goliath's head in the corner like a Little League trophy. And it's kind of eerie. And so David, yes, he's a man after God's own heart, but there might be a little bit of pride associated with this sense, right? And we get that sense even when David was asking, so what's the reward for doing this, right? So yes, David is doing his job. Yes, he is acting faithfully, but is David sinless? Certainly not. Does David probably have a little bit of pride in this moment? Of course. He's a teenage boy who's just had this big victory, right? And so there is this sense that he's a little bit attached to the trophies that he gets there that day. And we're kind of going to see it a little more in David's life as time goes on. Any other questions or comments on the text there? Yeah, a little bit grim. Not really a Sunday school craft to make Goliath's head, but I'm sure someone's done it. The wheels are turning in Sarah's mind, I'm scared. Verse 55, as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? He's already forgotten. And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. So again, I can relate to Saul in not remembering the name of the kid. He meets a lot of people in his line of work. He probably thought he was just going to die anyway, right? And so now he's succeeded. But again, we get this little detail, and this is important. Remember, Abner is Saul's uncle. And Abner is the strong man, the tough guy from their town in the tribe of Benjamin, right? We remember that Abner was kind of the strong guy. And Abner is the person that Saul kind of leans on. He's the uncle that he kind of always goes to for help in the battle. And so even in this moment of military victory where you would think Saul would immediately kind of try and run and overtake David and be like, yeah, let's go guys, and try to have some sort of glory, even in this moment, Saul is still going to someone else. He's going to Abner to basically do this. And we get this sense that Saul doesn't like to get his hands dirty. He doesn't like to do the job. And so he just calls David over and hears this about David. Now there's a next little section that we can cover, but it's kind of a different. It's a big shift in gears. But I think we're gonna try it anyway, and we might have to divide it a little bit over the next two sessions. So, the beginning of chapter 18. We're going to read something about David and Jonathan, which was not controversial for a very long time, but now in today's world and culture, it really is. So I'm going to read the text for you first, and then we're just going to discuss it. Chapter 18, verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. All right. I'm going to pause our video there.